Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Tech Tactics Live. It's great to see a full house here. We are not at PCA's national headquarters. We're here in Easton, Pennsylvania at Porsche's Training Center and Distribution Center. So we want to definitely thank them for hosting us. It's so great to be back here with Tech Tactics East. Want to make sure we thank our sponsor, Pirelli. Without this, none of this would happen. Be sure if you're watching online to hit that like button, comment, and subscribe. I'll be monitoring the live chat. So if you have questions today, we'll be presenting them to our speakers. And of course, we'll be taking questions from the live audience as well. So we are going to be talking about how to keep your Porsche running right. We have Lake Speed Jr. and Charles Navarro. Both of them have been together with us on various Tech Tactics live events, as well as at Parade and such. And so right now, we'll go right into the agenda of what they'll be covering. They'll be covering oils, our favorite tribologist here. Right. We'll tell you about the types and how often you should change it. Fuel, top tier, injector, additives, understanding oil analysis. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you guys.
Thank you, Boo.
Well, thank you everyone for coming, and for those of you who are online watching this live. So we'll get right into the meat of this. So first thing I always bring up in every presentation is drive your Porsche. It is not a coffee table. I'm sure most of you have heard me already say this once, that there's nothing worse than people who don't actually drive their Porsches. If you don't drive it, sell it and buy something you're going to drive. Letting your car sit for extended periods is the worst thing you can do. Especially you find those cars that are super low mileage, that have never been driven, they're going to be disasters when you get into them, because they weren't driven, obviously, because they have no mileage on them.
And short trip driving is terrible. I mean, the worst thing you could do, literally, this time of year, is be worried about, your valve springs, taking a seat or something because they've not been moved, and go over there and crank your car and let it run in the garage for a minute or two and shut it down. That's literally the worst thing you can do for your car. If you're worried about valve springs and all that kind of stuff, and things being under load, don't. So if you don't know, my dad was a NASCAR driver for 20 years. And we actually, this past summer, took one of his old engines that had been sitting on the floor of the shop for 18 years. It had been built 20 years ago, raced for a couple of years, and it literally sat for 20 years, almost 18 years, We took the engine apart. After we dynoed it, it was down 200 horsepower from where it was, brand new. And of course, we were looking for the broken parts. And when we had the video online about the engine being down 200 horsepower, one of the most common theories was, the valve springs are dead. The rocker arms are bent, all these kind of things from it sitting because no one turned it over for 20 years. Took it all apart. All the rocker arms were great. Every valve spring checked within 5 pounds of the spec sheet. So guess what? It's okay for your engine to sit there all winter. The best thing you can do when you put your car away for the winter is make sure the tank of fuel is full. It's got fuel additive in it. Put the battery tender on it. Don't touch it. If you're not able to drive it, don't crank it. And you go out, go drive it. Put your foot in the throttle. It's funny, we were talking that whole history lesson with my dad's engine. I learned something about carburetors. So in the old days, when you had like a Holley double pumper, with a vacuum secondary, there's actually tiny little holes drilled under the base plate to allow the fuel in the back to leak out. Because if Grandma was driving the car with a double pumper on it, guess what? She never got in the throttle. So the fuel would go bad in the back, and it would stumble and bumble. So I had to drain it all out because the fuel would go bad, like Charles said.
Yep.
If you have one, drive it. If you want it to be a garage queen, just let it be a garage queen. Don't drive it. But to me, all I want to do is get in that thing and go drive it.
Yep. So we're going to get right into Porsche spec oils. So the specs you have, everyone probably is aware of an A40 spec. The newer spec oils are the C spec, so you have the C20, C30, and C40. Basically, those have been formulated to protect the engine, one, against low-speed pre-ignition. So they've reduced the calcium detergent additive and also eliminated sodium detergent additive out of there. The other reason that these oils are reformulated, they're low ash, so they're to protect the gasoline particulate filters on the engines, because a lot of the new cars are coming with that because they determined after they went to direct injection that gasoline powered cars are actually putting out as much soot at the tailpipe as a diesel. You just don't see it.
And that's the biggest part with DI. So with DI, you get a higher compression ratio. They're fantastic engines because of that higher efficiency. But like Charles mentioned, there's two things that kind of come along or the bad side of DI. One, you can have what's called low-speed pre-ignition, which is a type of detonation event, engine knock, that is caused by the additive package in the oil. Specifically, like Charles mentioned, calcium and sodium detergents increase the tendency of low-speed pre-ignition. And the old A40 spec, those oils would be somewhere probably around 3,000 parts per million calcium. To prevent low-speed pre-ignition, you got to be below 1,500 parts per million. So that's a big change of why you went from A40 to C40. And then, like Charles mentioned too, your lower ash content, because those oils also can contribute to particulate emissions. And of course, we're trying to limit that down.
And then lastly, you have the oils from Porsche Classic. So you have their, obviously you have the 1550, or was it 1060, and then what's the other, a 2050, yeah, there's a few Porsche Classic oils for your older cars. So service intervals, that's probably the biggest thing people ask me, how often should I change my oil? After years and years of seeing literally probably thousands of used oil analysis results, I recommend a 6-month or 5,000-mile oil change interval. The idea is we're changing the oil before it's completely used up all its additives. And also, there's combustion byproducts, moisture, all kinds of other things that build up in the oil that can wear the oil out, basically. So you want to replace it before the oil's dead.
I've seen, because we do oil analysis, and we see, like Charles said, thousands of Porsche oil samples each year. I've seen a brand new oil, the 040 Mobile One, for example, be completely killed with only 261 miles on it. Moisture. So oils that have esters in them, which we won't get too much into oil chemistry today because that's a whole other topic by itself. But esters are a type of base stock, synthetic base stock. And if you have esters, they can be hydrolyzed. The acid, basically when you make an ester, you're taking an acid and an alcohol and you react it, and it makes an ester and water. Well, all chemistry can go both ways. So if I have an ester and I have water, short trip driving, humid environments, things like that, that water can now undo my ester. And you can see that on the oil analysis report. I don't think we have an example of one today, but remind me when we get to the oil analysis reports, I can point out the oxidation number. If you have an oil, like say Mobile One 0W40 is a ester blend, it's got ester in there, so it's going to start off with an oxidation value about 38. If it goes down, it's because the ester is hydrolyzing. In this particular sample, it went from 40 down, or basically 38 down to 12, which is about almost what a conventional oil is. And it did it in 261 miles over about an 18-month period. Back to, you didn't drive it, but depending upon how it's been stored and what you're doing, it can be dead. So it's important to make sure you observe these service intervals and make your oil change intervals match how you're using the car.
Yeah, and likewise, if you put your car away for the winter, that's why you should store it with clean oil.
Exactly.
And you don't need to, in the spring, change the oil again.
No.
If you put it away clean and you didn't start it up and let it idle or take short drives in the winter with it, then you're good. You can just drive it the rest of the next season.
Exactly. Okay, top tier fuels. So, fuel is the enemy of your oil. The same base oils that we use in motor oil are also used in industrial turbine engines. This can last tens of thousands of hours. So why can't we go tens of the thousands of miles? Well, the biggest difference is combustion. In a turbine, it's just as hot as an internal combustion engine. but there's no fuel, there's no combustion byproduct exposed to the oil itself. In internal combustion engines, it is. So the fuel quality makes a huge difference. Because you got to remember, the job of the injector is to atomize the fuel. Atomization just means it's a small, fine droplet. It's still a liquid. You can't burn a liquid. You can only burn a vapor. It's part of the reason why DI engines actually make soot. What's the soot from? It's from unvaporized fuel. That's why diesels make all that black smoke. But that carbon, that black smoke, is unvaporized fuel. So you got to vaporize the fuel. Well, if your injectors are dirty, so think about this intake valve. Of course, a port-injected engine, you're going to get some kind of reversion. These things are going to be hot. So you can see the difference between a regular fuel and a top-tier fuel. So AAA did a study recently where they commissioned it, independent research lab, top-tier 93 versus just regular 93. The regular, they call it the lowest additive concentration. The EPA mandates a minimum level of detergent in fuel. If the pump doesn't have the top tier thing on it, or it's not a top tier brand, it doesn't have to have that higher level of detergency. In this case, between top tier and lowest additive concentration, it was a 19-time difference. So 19 times more deposits for the regular 93 versus the top tier 93. That's a big difference if you have a port injected engine. It's even a bigger deal if you have a direct injection deal. Because what happens with direct injection is, okay, while the engine's running, it's not going to cause deposits. But it's when you shut the car off in the fuel that's in the injector, and that injector happens to be where? In the combustion chamber. It will then coke. It will carbon up. Now that injector can't flow the fuel properly. It can't atomize the fuel properly. If the fuel can't atomize properly, it will not vaporize. So what's going to happen is it's going to have an impact on your fuel economy. In the AAA study, the difference between top-tier fuel and regular fuel was about a 2% difference in fuel economy. Huge. The great news was when they actually just switched and started top tier on the same engine, they've been running lowest additive concentration, it actually cleaned it up. So it really pays to use the better fuels, especially in a DI engine. But you also want to make sure, if you can, stay away from E10 in the older cars. What's the year cutoff on that?
It's pretty much anything before a Boxster. Porsche put out a bulletin well over 10 years ago, and it said that you could only run E5. Well, I haven't seen E5 in a very long time. So really any older Porsche should be running some sort of fuel additive that helps with ethanol.
Yeah, and we have to make a little side note here right now about this. Because of the fuel shortage, right? So, I can't believe it's been 3 years since we were here. It was 2020 was the last one right here, and then the pandemic happened. Okay, what happened during the pandemic? Well, global fuel demand plummeted. So what happened was we lost 3 million barrels a day of refining capacity globally. Well, 3 million barrels a day has not come back online. Most of that will never come back online. So we're now about 1 million of that back. We're hoping to get about another 500,000 back by the end of the year. Point being, last summer, when gas prices were skyrocketing, the federal government waived the E10 requirement, which allowed them to put in more ethanol in the fuel. There's a white paper, you can go find it, that was put out by the Energy Department that said we had record volumes of ethanol in our fuel last summer. And I can tell you, we saw it in the dyno, because we do all kinds of engine testing, and we go to the same place, buy the same gas all the time, and the engine's off 8 horsepower. Because ethanol has less energy concentration. So that's what killed us on power, because they were pumping more ethanol in the fuel. So everybody that has a classic Porsche, you need to be using a fuel additive because there's no way around it. They're probably going to do it again this summer. They did it last summer. The entire summer, they waived the restriction and allowed them to put in more than 10% ethanol in everything. It will probably happen again this summer just because the refining situation hasn't really changed. It takes years to bring back refineries, and most big companies have said, we're not bringing them back. You know, with the threat of the EV, they're like, why do we need to do it? It doesn't make any sense financially. So it's really important to be using a fuel additive. Let's go to the next one because I think it shows it on there. Oh, this is your injectors, yeah.
So there's one other thing I want to mention before we move on, and that is non-ethanol or ethanol-free fuels like Rec 90, something you see around lakes or water sports, any of that stuff. They're usually formulated with the same additive levels as a top-tier fuel, like the detergents, the lubrication enhancers, all those items. There is one issue if you don't want to be switching between ethanol-free and ethanol-enriched because you can have phase separation.
Yeah, the ethanol-blended fuel can hold water in it. The non-ethanol fuel will not. So it's important to have your fuel tank as empty as possible before you make the switch. And like you don't make the switch if you've been sitting all winter or something like that. Just a little side note, Rec 90 is essentially premium without the ethanol. Because what goes down the pipeline does not have ethanol in it. There's a lot of familiar faces. You may have heard me say this in the past. But when people say, well, all the same fuel in the pipeline. Well, that's true. It's when it gets to the terminal is when they put in the additives and they put in the ethanol. So when they make premium in the refinery, it's the same premium, whether it's going to be for non-ethanol, for 5%, 10%, or whatever. So if you use the Rec 90 with a bottle of fuel additive, you know you're good. And even though it's 90, not 93, your engine will like it because guess what? Once you have water in your fuel, and there's going to be water wherever there's ethanol, there's nowhere outside of a lab, once you have atmospheric moisture, ethanol is going to bring in water, that you're going to have some level of phase separation and your engine's not really getting the full 93.
So speaking, and I really do believe the ethanol fuels are part of what are contributing to this. So this is an example of an injector inspection. This particular engine had cylinder bore scoring. And what you can see here, I'll point out if you can't see it, leak test. So 2 of the injectors leaked and had poor spray patterns. Those are the 2 cylinders that had bore scoring. So what happens if you don't have good atomization of fuel, it's basically just pissing fuel into the cylinder and washing the oil off the bores, and that contributed to the problem. So here's an example that Lake provided that you can see here the amount of fuel dilution. So it had 2.56% fuel dilution in there, and then ran a bottle of driven injector defender in it. And the next time the oil was changed, the fuel dilution is less than 1%.
Yeah, so here he was normal. He was about 1.6%. We see typically around 1.5 or so is pretty typical. But then it had jumped up. I'm not sure why, but we all know it has to do with the ethanol in the fuel and the LAC type fuel. But then with one treatment, one bottle, it brought it right back down. Is way better. The other thing you can see too, you can't see it on this one, but overall, the wear goes down. Well, you can actually see it right here because this is the Boxster. So one of the wear metals in the Boxster isn't a metal. It's silicon. It's an alusil bore. So you see right here at 1.6% fuel dilution, 7 parts per million silicon. At 2.5%, it goes up to 11. Then at 0.9%, it goes down to 8. Right back down. So back to what Charles was saying about bore scoring. Fuel dilution and bore scoring go hand in hand. If you want to prevent and protect yourself from bore scoring, you've got to make sure you're staying on top of the fuel and make sure you don't have injector deposits.
Yeah, you can also see what the fuel dilution was doing to the
Viscosity.
the viscosity.
Yeah.
And remember, the oil film on the cylinder board that separates the piston from the cylinder and the rings from the cylinder, that film, that viscosity, that's what's providing you the protection.
It's the first line of defense in
Yeah.
your engine.
So when that viscosity drops, your actual protection drops.
Absolutely. And here's a great example of what the fuel additive can do. Because it's not about the brand of fuel additive. Nathan mentioned something about being platform agnostic when it comes to how you buy cars. I'm brand agnostic when it comes to oils and fuels. What I am religiously passionate about is the chemistry. And if it doesn't contain polyetheramine, PEA, don't use it. All right, so I'm just going to put a couple of brands out there that some people have used and have heard, I see frequently that do not contain polyetheramine. Do not use seafoam in anything unless you're trying to blow it up. Anything that says you can put it in your fuel and your oil, run far, far away. Okay? There is no PEA in seafoam. Marvel Mystery Oil, same thing. Do not put it in your oil. Do not put it in your fuel. It does not contain polyetheramine. It's not going to help you. All right? So there are lots of different brands that contain it. You can see how much of an impact it makes on corrosion protection. So these two are with 10% ethanol on the same test coupon. But the one on the right that's clean has PEA in it. Back to what we talked about, what's coming up this summer, more than likely.
Yep.
Going to be more ethanol in the fuel. Well, you need to protect yourself. Only way to do it is use something that contains polyetheramine. That's the key thing to do.
And you'd see that in the MSDS. If it
Yes.
has it, it'll be listed there.
A lot of brands now are actually advertising it on the label. Of course, that one's got it.
Yeah, so here you have some examples. A few years back, Porsche Classic came up with their own fuel additive.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be anything 993 and earlier that's not supposed to be running E10. There's their additive, and there's the part number for anyone that wants it. And then also, like Lake said, the driven, the injector defender or
Yep.
the carb defender.
Yep.
It's all the same stuff, just
Yep.
packaged differently, because no one who has a carbureted car wants to put something that says injector and vice versa.
Hang on here for them. The one with the booster, that has octane booster in it. And just as a little side note, because it may not show up in one of the oil analysis reports, if you're using an octane booster and you're doing oil analysis, make sure in the notes that you make that note that you're using an octane booster. What's going to happen is octane boosters contain MMT, manganese. It's going to show up in your oil analysis. That way they know. So no one freaks out. That way you don't get back a yellow warning report that you've got valve guide wear. No, you don't. You just run an octane booster.
And there's no point to using, if you have an older air-cooled Porsche, there's no point to using the booster, because it's really more for a modern vehicle that has knock sensing and can put more timing into the engine when it knows it has better fuel and better
Right.
chemistry. That's where something that has an octane booster is recommended.
Especially if you're going to be tracking the car using pump gas.
Yep. So now we're to oil additives versus using oil without additives. I get a lot of these questions. People say, well, I can just go to Walmart, buy some cheap oil, and throw an additive in it. And one that comes up is this, like a ZDDP additive. And if you use any additives in your oil, it's just a chemistry experiment.
It's chemical Russian roulette with your engine.
Yeah.
You should never, ever put anything in your oil. If you think your oil is not going to do the job by itself, get a different oil. It's just not worth it. That's different for fuel, right? Fuel, that's a different thing. But oil, no, no.
I would say an exception to this rule, like the Liquimoly, the Ceratec, that if you're using a Liquimoly oil, it's the chemistries are going to be compatible. That you could take that Liquimoly oil and then add the Ceratec, because for an example, an A40 spec oil, even though it's a Liquimoly brand, just because it says Moly in the name doesn't mean there's Moly in the oil. That's just a brand.
Yeah.
And it can't, because it's an A40 spec oil. There's a recipe that the manufacturers have to follow for that oil to be A40 approved, and they can't deviate from that recipe. So adding an additive like this to your oil will boost the friction modifiers, and that's a good thing for cylinder bore scoring.
Right.
Because the bores are raw aluminum in a Boxster, Cayman, 911, Cayenne, Macan, Panamera. They're all a raw aluminum, whether it's a Locasil or an Alusil bore. There is no plating, there's no wear surface on that cylinder. It's raw aluminum with exposed silicon particles. And the only thing that's separating the rings and the piston from that bore is the oil. And ZDDP cannot bind to aluminum.
Nope.
So
It's polar, so if it's not a ferrous material, it can't do anything to it.
yeah, so moly can. Moly can form on the cylinder bores.
Exactly.
So this is a good graphic representation. So moly, when you expose it to temperature and pressure, will form, they call it glassy plates. So basically, as you have something running over that surface with the moly on it, it'll slough the surface off, and then it'll build another layer of that moly on there. So it's continuously removing and applying, removing and applying. So rather than wearing that surface, it's actually wearing that moly layer off that surface.
And that's the thing about moly, is it doesn't need it to be a ferrous surface for it to begin to form that film. It doesn't need any heat. It just needs that pressure for it to do it, which is why, in a lot of the forums, the Ceratec became a popular additive for the guys with the Macans and the Caymans, or the Cayennes, because those engines needed it. The higher moly level makes a big difference. That was one way of getting it in there, but again, don't really want to do it that way. There's other ways you can do it.
So as far as oils, and everyone knows that I recommend the Driven oils. Back when Lake was with Driven, that we helped develop the oils for the Porsche applications, and we ran these oils, the A40 equivalent, which is the DT40, or the C40, which is the DI40. We ran all these oils in our cars, in Porsches and other European vehicles, and did used oil analysis. And what I tell people, don't take my word for it. Go on to Renlist, onto like the 996 forum, the 997 forum. People post used oil analysis results, and nothing beats the DI40 and the DT40 in these engines if you just see back-to-back comparisons to any other brand of spec oil. And that's not to say there are other boutique oils out there that are good, like Miller's in the UK makes a really good product. It's just buying it here is twice as expensive as buying Driven. And it's formulated very much the same. It's a high moly content oil. It's blended very much the same. But there are other oils out there that work really well, but I have a lot of personal experience with this, as do my customers.
Even my daughter, when she was working with me doing this oil analysis, she has a chemistry background, but not really an automotive background. And she even said, "Dad, there's a big difference between the Driven stuff and everybody else's stuff." I can see it, right? Because all we're seeing these samples the other day, she's like, the DT40 oil always has a lower level. She knows, she recognized which oil was going to be which before even seeing what brand it was. Just because so many oils have their own patterns. And that one tends to be the best. I mean, I'm a big fan of this one personally, but.
So what's the difference between
So the DT40 is basically for something that you would put an A40 spec oil into, and the DI40 is something you would put a C40. So the DI40 meets the Euro 6. It's a Euro 6 standard.
Yeah, so it's basically was developed from the ground up for direct injection.
Yep.
So it has that lower calcium level and all that. So that's what really makes this oil different than that. This oil was developed before direct injection was a thing we had to worry about. So it had a higher detergent level and all that. So when the DIs came around, we were fortunate enough, when I was working at Driven, we were working with GM and Oak Ridge National Lab doing a 3 or 4 year project just on oils for direct injection engines to prevent low speed pre-ignition. So we were able to borrow a lot of that technology from that testing to develop this oil. That is my Rockstar favorite one right there. That's what I run in my own car.
And that's what I run in most of my cars as well.
Yeah.
So,
Questions at the end? At the end, yeah. Okay. Okay, so oil analysis, and that's where the proof's in the pudding, right? We can say all we want to about chemistry, this, that, and the other thing. In the end, put it to the test yourself, right? Because that's what used oil analysis does. If you didn't know, every single Formula One team does oil analysis at the racetrack. So you've got really three main engine builders right now in Formula One. You've got Mercedes, you've got Ferrari, and Red Bull, the Honda deal. Those guys actually have a lab that goes to the racetrack. And they have a little mobile lab. They run all the same tests that we run at Speed Diagnostics on their oil at the racetrack. They do trend analysis because they know the metallurgy of all the parts. So it's the way of knowing what's the health of the engine, what's the health of the gearbox without ever taking it apart. So this is really the best thing you can do. No different than going to the doctor and having an annual checkup, taking a blood sample to know where you are. This is the exact same thing for your engine. And what we do, I mentioned with the Porsche deal, so the rotating disc method, the RDE, is what we use to do the wear metals because it's a non-diluted sample. So there's a lot of the mainline labs that are doing the high volume type approach. They just call it an ICP, where you spray the oil through a plasma. Because what you're having to do to look at the oil in terms of wear metals, you have to burn it. So when you burn something, every element has its own unique wavelength of light that it emits when it burns. So when you burn the oil completely, it will show up all of those elements. All those wavelengths of light will be emitted, and then the intensity of that wavelength of light tells you how much there is of it. That's the process. So when you do the ICP, because they have to spray it, they dilute it. As such, you can only see particles that are about 5 microns in size. So if there's a wear particle in your oil that's 8 microns in size, you can't see it. It's blind to it. With the rotating disc method, because you're not diluting it to spray it, it's actually being dipped and then put through a wire arc, it can see particles up to 10 microns in size. So it has twice the resolution or visibility. That's a big key. That way you can begin to see what all those wear metals are, and it also gives you all the additives levels as well. So all this part of that report all comes from that. And then we also add in gas chromatography. So most labs are going to use flash point as a way to determine fuel dilution. Well, the problem is the flash point of winter blend fuel is different than the flash point of summer blend fuel. And there are 47 different fuel specifications in the United States today. So if you're in California versus Pennsylvania, you will have different fuel. That means you can't take the same oil, look at the same flash point, and actually determine correctly how much fuel is in the oil. With gas chromatography, you're actually looking specifically at the number of fuel molecules in the oil, because all fuels are within a same carbon range in terms of the length, the number of carbon molecules in, or carbon atoms in the molecule. So with gas chromatography, you can see that, and then we're also going to use what's called FTIR to evaluate the health of the oil. TBN, total base number, is a test that's been around for a long time. It was originally developed for diesel engines back in the days when we had high sulfur diesels. Now here's the key to that. When you had high sulfur fuel, it would create sulfuric acid, because the byproduct of combustion is water. So even in diesels in the old days, you were going to be creating very strong acids like sulfuric acids. So you had magnesium, sodium, calcium in very high levels as acid neutralizers. We don't have high sulfur fuels today. So guess what? Test does not matter anymore. Total base number. Forget about it. Cummins doesn't use it. They're the largest independent engine builder in the world. They build more diesels than anybody else in the world. So if they have disregarded a test for diesel engines, why are we using it for gasoline engines? We don't. We shouldn't. It's stupid. So it's not a good tool to use, FTIR. which looks at the oxidation, the chemical degradation of the base stock, that's a better test for determining that. The other thing you can look at, okay, here's a good example of that rotating disc versus ICP. Same sample, both test methods, one showing up at 50, one showing up at 75. Exact same sample, two different labs. The only difference is the test method. So I'd rather have more, that way I can see where we are, because the trend analysis is the big key. You want to have accurate data you can lean on to make good decisions.
And you can't, this also means you can't willy-nilly switch between labs, because if you're using Blackstone, you can't compare a Blackstone result, for example, to a speed diagnostic result, because they're using a different process.
Exactly.
So so if you go from one lab to the other and now you have more wear metals, don't get concerned.
Right.
It's because you're seeing more. They were already there. The other test just wasn't picking it up.
Right. Now, back to what we said earlier about viscosity. Viscosity is the number one most important characteristic of any lubricant. The way we measure viscosity so we should back up for a second. Viscosity grades. So the number before the W is the winter cold cranking viscosity of the oil. That's a rotational measurement. It's not a flow measurement. A 20W50 is not a 20 when it's cold and a 50 when it's hot. Let that sink in for a second. Because everyone's told you differently, right? Nope. W does not stand for weight. It stands for winter. If a 20W50 went from a 20 to a 50, it would have means it got thicker as it got hotter. That never happens. All oils get thinner as they get hotter. The number before the W, again, W is winter, is a rotational measurement. We take the oil, we put it into a beaker, you put a rotor in it, and you measure the torque it takes to turn. And you keep chilling that beaker down, making it colder and colder in the Stokes. Now, for us in here, since most of our cars call for a 40, this is the number you want to be looking at. So what you don't want to see is you get your oil analysis reports back to see your SAE grade be under 12.5. Right? If you got a 0W40 and it comes back and it's in the 11 range, that means it sheared down to a 30 or was diluted by the fuel down to a 30. You're losing your viscosity, you're losing your protection. All right, so some do's and don'ts. You should, for trend analysis, because that's what gives you the best, clearest picture, you should do samples regularly. You know, if you don't drive your car more than a couple thousand miles a year, do it once a year. Use the sample bottle that's provided in the thing. Guys, follow the instruction sheets. You hear me again? Gentlemen, follow the instruction sheets. It's in there for a reason. A handful of times a year, we will receive samples at the lab. And there's no submission form for it. They just took it out of the box, they filled it, they dropped it in the mail. It's in a bag that has a big stop sign on it that says, stop, read the instructions before you send it in. Because on the instruction sheet it says, go online, fill out the form. We have no idea. There's about 6 orphan samples we have right now that someone bought the kit, they took the sample, they sent it in. I have no idea whose they are. And if you never call us, we'll never know. And maybe we can try to figure it out. I don't know. So please, because we want to give you your results. We really do. But you got to follow the instruction sheets. And like Charles said, you don't want to jump around from a lab to lab. You want to make sure whatever sample procedure you're using, you always follow the same procedure. Because how you take the sample will have an impact on what the results are. You know, it's the best thing to do is to go drive the car. Good excuse to go drive the car, by the way. Drive the car, get it warmed up, and then take the sample. You know, crack the drain plug, let it drain, count to 3 Mississippi, and then put it in there, fill it 3/4 of the way full, package it up, send it off, do the submission form online as well. That way everything works. And then, you know, don't get too caught up on a single value. you want to look at the whole, because that's where you're going to get the best picture, and that trend analysis over time is what really gives you really powerful information about your vehicle, the way you drive it, so you can make good decisions.
And like the comments, a lot of people get hung up. A lot of people use Blackstone and they write their comments. If you use Blackstone,
Ignore the comments.
just don't read the comments. They're absolutely worthless. They're like, oh, there's high. I've seen samples from engines that had bore scoring, and they say, well, the silicon content's high. You need a new air filter.
Yeah, change your air filter.
Or someone said, like, well, how's my IMS bearing? And the results said, well, you don't see the wear from the IMS bearing because the IMS bearing has a separate lubrication system. I'm like,
If it's failing, you will see it.
so the commentary, just please don't use the commentary. Look at the raw data.
Yeah. Now, limitations. As we mentioned earlier, it can't see things larger than 10 microns. So if you have a sample that looks like metallic paint, you probably already know what's going on. So you can see samples that look like paint from that car that have very low air metals. It's because the particles now are so large it can't be seen. Now, what you can see from that still are things like fuel dilution. Because I will tell you right now, we've been beating up on fuel today a little bit. 9 times out of 10, when we see a sample that has high wear metals, there's also high fuel dilution. Fuel dilution is what's going to kill the viscosity, which is going to increase the wear in the engine. That's the dominoes effect right there. So if you fix the fuel dilution, you're probably going to fix the wear problem. So at that point, it's going to let you know maybe what the root cause was. Other thing too is it can't see things that are non-metallic. So if you've got tensioners that are wearing, they're plastic, it can't see it. So if it's destroyed with water, it'll test positive for water, but we can't test the viscosity. We've seen some people who run E85 in their cars, and with E85, there's so much water in there that you can't run the 100 degrees C viscosity test. Any guesses as to why you can't run viscosity with water at 100 degrees C? Boiling point. Yeah, there we go. I love it. So that's, and then other thing too, a good note here is the cross pollination. If you are going to use oil analysis as a way to choose the brand of oil or the type of oil that you're going to use for your car, know this, that when you change from one to the other, the first sample on the other is probably going to go up. The base oil is the carrier for the additives. When you drain all the oil out of the engine, guess what's still on all the metal parts in the engine? The additives from the old oil. So what happens with the new oil? It's got to displace all of that. So when you change brands, you're probably going to see a slight increase on the first one. Go to the second one and the third one, look at that trend, and you'll see what it really does. Like the worst thing you could do for your car is go to whoever has the special on oil that month and switch between brand to brand to brand to brand, because that's actually going to cause a higher wear level because you're always changing the additive package so that additive film you were trying to form to protect your engine, you're destroying it and trying to replace it. So that's another key thing to keep in mind.
So I've already touched on, I don't need to go into this deeper, but the choice of what oil you use and also keeping your injectors clean, those are the best things you can do to try to mitigate the bore scoring issue. And from the oil analysis, just wanted to make sure we cover this. So the wear metals that we see with bore scoring, and this was a Cayman S, and this particular customer was very upset. He had just switched to driven, and he said, well, the driven ruined my engine. Well, he had oil analysis from before running the Mobile One, and it was already scored beforehand. Once it's already started to have a problem, there's no miracle liquid you can put in the engine that's going to undo the damage.
And the key thing where you can see that this was the case is the silicon jumped up to 13 here. Remember, as Charles mentioned, these bores are aluminum with silicon particles impregnated in them. So the ring is actually riding on the silicon particles, not on the aluminum. So when it starts to score, what's going to happen is the silicon particles are going to begin to break away, and it's going to begin to damage the iron coating on the skirts of the pistons, because the pistons are also aluminum, and that's the downside, right? You can't have those two running together. So what you have is you have silicon and iron. Well, 13 ppm silicon, 15 ppm of iron. Most of these engines, that iron level is going to be single digits most of the time. When you see the silicon go up and the iron go up, this was kind of the early warning radar. Then what happens is, now the silicon's going even higher because there's a ton more silicon. But guess what? That iron went down. Well, why did the iron go down? Well, one, the mileage went way down. That's why you can't just fixate on the numbers by itself. This is 3,200, almost 3,300 miles. This is less than 300 miles. So look at the trend on that. 8 ppm in 300 miles is a lot compared to this. But what's happening is my silicon's gone way up. He's full on bore scoring. But that's how you know it, is you got to watch those as a group, and then the aluminum will start coming up too, which is why it's so important when you see here the total wear metals divided by the miles. I mean, you go from essentially at 50 miles, like your wear rate per 50 miles, he's at basically 0.6% or 0.6 parts per million to 5.3 parts per million.
Yep.
And you can also see too, from bearing examples, okay, how do you know those numbers mean anything? Well, you can look at this bearing and compare it to that bearing. Well, your eyes can see the difference in those two bearings. We all can see the difference, right? This one's got way more wear than this one does. Well, you can also see this one's got 16 parts per million lead, because a tri-metal bearing is copper, tin, lead. So you're 27 parts per million total of bearing wear material up here. Down here, we're at 16. You can see that physical difference, and that's where how you can begin to correlate and know that when you see these higher numbers, you see them creeping up, this is what's happening in your engine, which is why it's so important to be able to see it and know these things. And this is why I love DI-40. Yeah. So GT3, car that sees tons of track time, and back to, you can really get a good picture when you have trend analysis that he's going, 1,300 miles, 3,400 miles, 1,700 miles, 2,300 miles, 4,000 miles. And you can see the viscosities hanging in here. Now, in this case, fuel dilution went up a little bit. Used some fuel additive, started to come back down. Not as much as it probably should have, but you're really driving the car, you're running it, and here's the key. Look at the silicon levels. There are almost none, right? And this is the guy that tracks his car. So, and when you're seeing that track use, now all of a sudden, I'm not worried about 17 parts per million iron, because that's 4,000 miles, and we're seeing track use in there. So when you look at the whole picture, it tells you a story.
At this point, we have tons more slides, but I think we'll take some questions at this
Yeah.
point.
All right, so if you don't mind, a couple questions for those that are watching online, and we apologize to those of you that are watching online, and we had the Wi-Fi drop a little bit. So, but anyways, 93, is it possible to find that ethanol free?
Usually not.
Usually not.
Yeah, it's very challenging to find 93 ethanol free. Yeah, I've seen it in some places, but it's pretty rare.
So, along with that question, Mark Woodsma asked, you mentioned Defender as an additive?
Yeah.
Is that the only, obviously there's others, or there's others that you recommend to combat the excess ethanol?
So what you want is something that contains polyethylamine. That's the key thing.
PEA.
So, PEA, that's the key thing you're looking for.
Okay. And one more question is, should I only use a fuel injector cleaner right before an oil change and then change the oil?
Yeah, I've had that question before, and that's interesting. I don't see that as a thing. And people worry that they're going to run an injector cleaner, it's going to have a bunch of junk in the oil, and then it's going to make the oil analysis look bad. I don't see that as a problem.
So, doesn't matter.
No.
Okay. Questions from the crowd?
Lots.
In the middle there.
So the purpose of the C40 oil over any other spec is better for direct injected engines?
Yes.
So the question was C40 oil specific for direct injected engines.
Right. Now, here's what I'm going to say. It's better for every engine. Here's why. Back to our talk about calcium in TBN and how that was kind of a legacy thing. Calcium competes against the ZDP and against the moly. It's there to clean. When you lower the calcium levels, it makes everything else more effective. Every engine test that I've run, where we've run a high calcium oil versus a lower calcium oil, with the ZDP levels being the same, the lower calcium oil has better wear protection. So even though C40 is now for the new DI engines, it wouldn't scare me a bit to go put it in an engine designed for A40.
So in driven terms, if you've been using DT40 all this time, you're saying switch to the DI40?
You can. You don't have to, but you can.
It just costs more money because it's made with different base stocks that cost more money. It's closer to a race oil.
Yeah.
But would you consider that worth it to go with that extra cost to go from DT40 to DI40?
I pay for it. I still buy it.
You pay for it.
I mean, he knows. I buy it from him. I don't work for the company anymore. I don't get paid a dime for recommending this stuff. I buy it from him, but I know what it is, and I care enough about my car. I'm like, I'll pay the extra for it because I know how much better it is.
All right. Another question right there.
Does top tier fuel have PEA in it?
Yes.
And the other question to tie with that, is there a difference between top tier fuel between like Shell, Exxon, Snow?
Let me repeat the question.
Yeah.
So does top tier fuel have PEA in it? And you said yes.
Yes.
And then the next question was, top
there
tier
a
fuel,
difference?
is there a difference between brands?
Yeah, so top tier, again, is still a minimum standard, kind of like an API oil standard. So people can be certain levels above it. My favorite fuel is the Shell V-Power. If I can get it, I will, but you can't always get it. But if I have the choice, that's what I'll do. My second next one is going to be the ExxonMobil, the Synergy. It's awful good too.
What about Costco? They have another additive addition that adding it to top tier. You know anything about their
What was that question? I didn't hear.
Costco.
Costco's.
So the best thing to do is, if you're curious about any brand of fuel, is go to the top tier fuel website. And they have the lookup where you can find the stations and what brands and all that. I think, is it toptier.com or toptier?
If you Google it, you'll find it.
Yeah.
Question right there.
So, go back to earlier presentation, talking about Rec 20 fuel.
Rec 90.
Rec 90 fuel.
And Rec 90 is without ethanol.
Correct.
Is it closer to 91 with ethanol or 93 with ethanol? Where does it fall as far as the?
It's 90. It's the same base fuel as 93 with ethanol without the ethanol. So like 87 octane fuel is actually 83 octane fuel when it's in the pipeline. When they put in 10% ethanol, it bumps the octane up.
Question on the far right. Yep. Oh. Question is,
I would
can you
not.
mix A40 and C40 oil?
It's okay if you drain one out and put the other one in.
I'll answer. I can answer. I've seen this posed on Renless before, that you're driving your car, it bings, oh, you need to add oil, and C40, the Mobile One C40 oil is really hard to find.
Yes, it is.
There aren't lots of C40 oils readily available. If you had to top it off, the thing is, you have already a volume of oil in your engine. You're adding a little bit. It's not going to hurt if you add half a quart or even a quart. You just don't want to put A40 oil in something that calls for a C40, because then you could run the risk of low-speed pre-ignition. But just topping it off to get you back home or something like that, if you can't find it, that's perfectly fine.
If you find API SP, that's the same as C40. Or it's for direct injection. So if you could find a 1040 API SP, that would be work as a top-off oil better because it has that lower detergent package.
The gentleman with the IMSA hat. So for an air-cooled engine, additives that you would recommend?
Air-cooled, water-cooled, doesn't matter. Polyethylamine is what you want to have in it. The Driven Injector Defender is a great product because it has more than just PEA in it. It has other stabilizers and rust inhibitors. It's a really premium product. If you're out driving somewhere and you get stuck, right? I mean, because not everyone's, if you carry some in the trunk, that's great. But if you get a situation where you need some because you can't find good fuel, then look on the labels to see if there's someone with PEA in it. Then you should be fine.
We have a question here on the left.
I have a couple old air-cooled cars, the 87 930 and a 983 RS. The default oil was always Mobil 1 15W50.
Yep.
I haven't been racing and doing it for a lot of years. What oil should I be looking at now with some of these late model water-cooled cars?
So default oils that were labeled with the car when you bought it back in the day,
Or the engine builder said 50.
or the engine builder said, how do you upgrade or how do you determine what to use today?
I'll back up to the, so for air-cooled, what I recommend is the DT50. And basically the formulation, the chemistry is identical between DT40 and DT50. It's just the viscosity is different.
Does it go from 5 to 50?
Yeah, this is a 15W50 is what that is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the DT40 is a 5W40.
Do I need the 1550 or is it superstition from the olden days, 20 years ago?
So the rule of thumb for its temperature, what I was told 20 years ago when I started doing this, actually more than 20 years ago, that if the ambient air temps were, say, under 80 degrees, you could get away with using like a 5W40 or a 10W40 or 15W40. And if your ambient air temps were over 80 degrees, to use a 15W50 or a 20W50 with your air-cooled Porsche. That's what I was taught many years ago. But you could run a 15W50, a synthetic 15W50 in the car and not worry about starting. If you start at 32 degrees, it's going to be fine.
It's fine. Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend trying to start at like minus 30. I've been there, done that. And it won't turn over. I've tried.
Well, the key thing is back to bearing clearance. If you have a wider bearing clearance, you need a higher viscosity oil. All things else being equal. So if you don't know the bearing clearances, you're way better to lean on the safe side and put the higher viscosity oil in there.
Last question for the gentleman behind the TV.
You mentioned about 6-month oil changes. Does that apply to late model Porsches that do like 8,000 to 10,000 miles a year?
So 6-month oil changes, does
Well,
that
maybe
apply to newer
if you're
cars?
going to do, say, how do you say, 8 to 10,000 miles? Absolutely. Because I wouldn't. Okay. There's a difference between saying, how long can I use this oil versus having the lowest wear rate. Can you go back to one of the slides, Charles, where it says the GT3 car? Boom. Backward. Here we go. All right. What I like to do is look at the wear per 1,000 miles. Because in the end, why do we put oil in the car, in the engine? To protect the engine. So I want the lowest wear rate I can get. That's how I look at it. I don't, if I have to change the oil every 2,000 miles to get the lowest wear rate, that's what I'm going to do because oil is cheaper than engines. Some people have different opinions. They want to do less maintenance. They don't like the idea of environmental impact. That's fine. That's your choice. If that's what you want to do, then you do you. The way I look at it is this. I want the lowest possible wear rate. So what I'm going to do is look at my mileage. I'm going to look at the health of the oil in the engine as a whole. And if I have to go down to a 4,000 mile drain interval to hold that, that's what I want.
Are you guys happy with the oil that's specified by Porsche for like 22 GT3?
Oh yeah, so the C3 oil is awesome.
Yeah,
the C3.
Yeah, the C40. Yeah, the C40 oil.
Oh, yeah,
the C40 is a good oil.
Yeah, it's great. You just hard to, like you said, it's hard to find.
And I would cut, and the interval, the oil change intervals, I tell people all the time, well, I'm under warranty, I want to use a factory approved oil, and I tell people, just cut the oil change interval in half. And that's going to be the best thing you can do. And once the car's out of warranty, then you can worry about putting whatever else you want to put in it. You surely can do better. But as far as Mobil 1's concerned, the C40 oil is a great oil.
Fantastic.
And there was a discussion on, I think, on the Macan forum or the Cayenne forum on Renlist in the last week or so, and talking about the C20 and the C30 oils. I'm torn about a 20 grade oil. It's trying to get you more fuel economy. That's a thinner oil. They're just trying to improve the fuel economy ratings by going to a thinner oil.
The other big variable in that question is how you accumulated those miles.
Yeah.
Short trip versus long trip driving, city versus highway. She passed away a couple years ago, but Shirley Schwartz used to work for GM. Her nickname was Sister Sludge. And she famously said that she could make anyone's oil, regardless of brand or type, fail within 3,000 miles. All she had to do was put that oil in her grandmother's car, because her grandmother lived in Green Bay, Wisconsin. She lived 1 mile from the church. She went to Mass every day. She lived 1 mile from the market, and she went to the market every day. And she drove the car 1 mile this way, 1 mile that way. And you do that in Green Bay in the winter, you're never going to get the fuel out. You're never going to get the moisture out. It would destroy the engine. And she's 100% right. So it's how you accumulate those miles is actually more important than the number of miles themselves.
All right, so with that, thank you, Charles. Thank you, Lake. Hope you enjoyed Tech Tactics Live. They'll be around to ask questions. And for those of you that are watching online, thank you for joining us.